Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if our thoughts about people maybe, just maybe, get stuck together in your brain? Today we're diving into some fascinating research that uses super cool math tools to peek inside our brains and see how we process information about age and whether we think something is good or bad. Think about it this way, we all have automatic reactions or biases. Right now, researchers have ways to try and measure these, but they aren't always sure exactly what they're measuring. This new study tries to open up that black box and figure out if age and our feelings about things get all mixed up in our minds from the very start. So what exactly is bias? Most simply put, it's when we treat one thing differently than another. And often that difference goes against what we think is fair or normal. In this study, they are focusing on implicit bias, which is like an automatic reaction we might not even realize we have. You might have heard of tests like the implicit association test, or I8. The idea is that if you consistently respond faster when you pair certain things together, like maybe older people and negative words, it might show you have an automatic bias against older people. But there have been a lot of questions about what these tests really measure. Do they truly capture a bias, or are they just picking up on other things like how familiar we are with the words or how hard it is to switch tasks? This is where the researchers got really creative. They decided to use tools from something called perceptual science. This field uses a lot of math to understand how we see and process information. They wanted to see if age and valence, that is the good or bad part, are tangled up together in our perception, or if we can separate them. They broke this down into three main stages of processing. First, perceptual independence. This is like asking if our brain naturally mixes up age and valence information when it first sees it. If they are not independent, then seeing an older face might automatically distort how we perceive the valence of a word, or vice versa. Second, selective attention. Even if we can perceive age and valence separately, can we actually focus on one while ignoring the other? Imagine trying to judge a face's age, but your mind keeps getting pulled by whether the word associated with it is good or bad. Third, workload capacity. This is about how efficiently our brain can process both age and valence at the same time. If it struggles to handle both, it might slow things down, and that slowing could look like a bias. To test the first stage, perceptual independence, they used a method called general recognition theory, or GRT. This sounds complicated, but the basic idea is to look at the kinds of mistakes people make when they have to categorize things. If age and valence are entangled, the errors people make will show a pattern. Like a tilted ellipse in a graph, if they are independent, the patterns would look more like circles. For the second stage, selective attention, they use something related to what is called Garner's speeded classification task. In simple terms, they'd ask people to focus on one thing, like the age of a face, and see if their reaction time changed depending on the other thing present. Like the valence of a word. If the reaction time is the same regardless of the word, then selective attention is working well. If it changes, there is interference. And for the third stage, processing capacity, they use systems factorial technology, or SFT. This method compares how fast people can do a task when it involves one piece of information versus when it involves two. If processing two things together is slower than expected, it suggests a limit in processing capacity. So how did they actually do this experiment? They had 97 participants play a couple of computer tasks. One task involved looking at faces and words together and trying to categorize them into four groups: old negative, old positive, young negative, or young positive. They carefully recorded how people responded. The other task was designed to test selective attention and capacity, where participants had to identify certain features while others were present. They also collected information about participants' explicit attitudes towards age. When they looked at the overall results, they saw that people were generally pretty good at the categorization task, figuring out the age and valence combinations correctly most of the time. But their mistakes often involved confusing things that shared at least one feature, like misjudging an old negative as old positive. This told them that both age and valence were definitely playing a role in people's decisions. Now, for the GRT analysis, they ran these fancy models on each person's patterns of mistakes. The most common finding was that for most people, age and valence were processed independently at this early perceptual stage. That is, the models that assumed independence and separability, meaning age and valence were seen as distinct and not distorting each other, fit the data best for about 71% of the participants. This suggests that for most people, their initial perception of age and valence doesn't get tangled up. Next, they looked at selective attention. They found that for a whopping 94 to 96% of the tests, people's response times were consistent whether the irrelevant dimension changed or not. And on a participant level, about 83.5% of people showed zero violations of this invariance. This means most people could focus on age without being significantly thrown off by the valence of a word, or vice versa. But here is where things got really interesting. When they looked at processing capacity using SFT, they found widespread violations of independence. Almost 90% of participants showed at least one deviation from what we'd expect if age and valence were processed completely independently. This means that when people had to process both age and valence at the same time, their cognitive systems architecture interacted in ways that weren't perfectly independent. This could mean processing was slower than expected, or even faster, but either way, it wasn't purely independent. Looking at individual differences, they saw a lot of variation. While some people showed perfect independence at all stages, most did not. The results from the capacity test showed that over 2/3 of participants had violations in multiple conditions. This suggests that while early processing might be clean for many, later stages of processing where multiple pieces of information are combined are often where the interactions happen. When they put all these findings together, they saw a clear pattern. While many participants were good at keeping age and valence separate at the perceptual and selective attention stages, the majority struggled with architectural independence. Only about 10% of participants showed unlimited capacity in all conditions. This means that even if you can see age and valence as separate things and even focus on one, your brain system for handling both at once might still have some built-in interaction. A really important question they addressed was whether these processing difficulties, these independence violations, were linked to people's conscious attitudes about age. They found surprisingly little connection. Even if people strongly preferred younger or older people, it didn't necessarily mean they had more problems with perceptual independence or selective attention. This suggests that the way our brain processes information about age and valence might be different from our conscious feelings about it. So what does all of this mean? The researchers found that while age and valence are often processed independently at early stages of perception and attention, they frequently interact at a later stage of processing capacity. This means that for most people, their brain's architecture for handling combined information about age and valence isn't perfectly independent. This is a big deal for understanding things like implicit bias. Instead of assuming that all bias comes from automatically activated associations or attention problems, this research suggests that the very structure of how our brains process information, the architecture, plays a key role. This could explain why some people show bias on tasks like the IAT. It might be due to these processing interactions. The study also found that explicit attitudes, what we consciously believe about age, didn't strongly predict these processing violations. This hints at a real distinction between our conscious beliefs and the automatic ways our brains process information. So, even if you consciously believe you aren't biased, your brain's processing pathways might still be showing some interaction. This has important implications for trying to reduce bias. If bias stems from architectural bottlenecks in processing, then simply trying to change associations might not be enough. We might need to develop interventions that are tailored to these different processing stages. It is also interesting to consider how perceptual scientists look at this. They often see these tests as a way to make sure that any observed effect is truly due to an attitude, not just how the brain is wired by default. But this study flips that idea a bit, suggesting that our attitudes themselves might actually shape that perceptual architecture over time. In the end, this research provides a complex but also a clearer picture of how we process information about age and valence. It shows that independence is often preserved early on but breaks down when we have to process both together. This gives us a more precise understanding of how biases might actually work at a fundamental cognitive level. It is like a roadmap showing us that bias isn't just one simple thing, but can arise from different parts of our cognitive machinery. This study is pretty remarkable because it uses sophisticated mathematical tools to get at these very fundamental questions about how our brains handle social information. It highlights that the way we process information can be just as important as the content of our thoughts and feelings when it comes to understanding social behavior and bias. It really opens up new avenues for thinking about how to measure, understand, and potentially change biases. I am incredibly impressed by the methodological rigor here. Applying these perceptual science models to social cognition is a fantastic step forward. It is really important to remember, though, that this study focused specifically on age and valence. We need to see if these patterns hold for other social categories like race or gender, and if the way we develop these processing architectures is consistent across different groups. What is exciting is how this can inform future research. Imagine being able to pinpoint exactly why someone shows a particular bias, whether it is at the early perception stage, the attention stage, or the capacity bottleneck. This could lead to much more effective interventions. So, what do you think about these findings? Does it change how you think about your own automatic reactions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the science of the mind. And as always, thanks for watching.